The country certainly needs to be a lot more unified if it's going to survive.
For Americans, the stakes are just very high.
That's probably one of the few times that I deviate from my libertarianism is when it comes to the protection of our children.
The job has gotten a lot harder because you're doing more with less.
Progress is progress, and there's a lot of people working to make that progress happen.
It's either this or I have zero options.
I grew up knowing that the police were the most dangerous people that you're going to encounter.
You know, these things are just normal life.
Hello and a very warm welcome to you to the 7th episode of Unpacking America, the podcast seeking to unpack America one conversation at a time. My name is John David Eastling. I am, as always, your host today, and it is an absolute pleasure to have you joining us once again. Today's episode is brought to you by El Machante, the #1 importers of Latin American and Caribbean music to the United States of America. But perhaps even more excitingly, they are running a huge project of archiving and circulating Latin American-based music and tracing its ancestry through the Caribbean and through its African roots. Really cool cultural project, and if you're into music and into the history and origins of music, I 100% recommend checking them out. The link is in our description for this episode. It is also up on our YouTube channel as well. So please give it a click, go and have an adventure, go and look at what they're up to. It is really cool. If you are one of our listeners in the LA area and you want to go and check them out, on the 16th of July, they are doing an event called Spiral Bound at 2220 Beverly Boulevard. So go and check them out. On the subject of where people are from, we get all sorts of statistics for running this podcast, and it's just been overwhelming to see how many people from different cities, not just across America, but globally, have been engaging with us. And I do want to give a huge shout out to the listeners in Port Harcourt. Guys, we saw you on the weekend, just blowing up our numbers. Thank you so much. Really appreciate the support and the love, so thank you. And with that, I think it is time for us guys to start unpacking a little bit more about America. What do you say?
The marriage analogy is a really good one. It's just like irreconcilable differences is a reason that a lot of couples cite for getting divorced. Just like we will never see eye to eye on this.
In a very real sense, this podcast only exists because of calls for national divorce, because of political and cultural polarization in the US. Throughout this series, we've had a number of guests talk about national divorce and on occasion talk about it like it's an inevitability. Like this is just the path America is now on. So today my guest is Shiri, who studies culture war and its impact in America. And she is a wonderful resource in terms of understanding the data and the metrics behind political divide. And unlike a lot of other conversations I've had, and I don't just mean on this podcast, I mean just in my day-to-day life, she's more solutions focused and more interested in looking at, well, how do we claw out of these divides? How do we find a solution? And she's not shy about saying that there's not a lot of room for hope. But I think, like me, she's very interested in finding what areas for hope we have and how we get people to start talking to each other again. And I do believe that at the end of the day, most Americans want to be able to find a way to reconcile. I do believe that cultural and political divides have ruined families and communities across this country. And I do believe that the reasons for that are smaller than we think, and that our similarities are much greater than our differences. So that is what today's episode is about. It is about trying to find where it is we go from here, and also take a long, hard look at how it is we got here. And so with that said, find your favorite podcast listening position, wherever that may be, get settled in, and let's get into it. Shiri, thank you so much for joining me today on Unpacking America. I know we've got a lot to get into, but I'm really excited to have you on the show.
It's great to be here. Thank you for having me.
I know we've had a little bit of a chat before sitting down today, but I'm almost ashamed to say you're the only Gen Z voice that we've had come on to season 1. So you're batting for a large population of US today.
Well, hopefully I do it justice. I know I'm on the older end, but I'm happy to represent Gen Z.
Your time will come. I'm now called an ancient millennial, and the time will come when you are an ancient Gen Zer, Zoomer.
Can't wait to see what comes next.
Oh gosh. So you're someone that's kind of interesting, and when I've met a lot of Americans overseas, they're people who were born in one state but then lived in three or four others, and you've sort of journeyed the length and breadth of the US and called a lot of different places home as you've grown up.
Yeah, I have. I grew up in Texas and in a couple of different places in Texas, I guess, North Texas, and then I went to college in Austin. And then my first job after college was all the way out in upstate New York, which I loved, and I lived there for 2 years. And then I lived in Atlanta for a year, and I think that's the last place I lived before now, where I live in Southern California.
So you've really done south, north, the center, and the west coast as well. Like it's kind of given you a real broad experience of living in the US.
Yeah, I guess you could say that now that I think about it.
and as someone who's traveled a lot but also met a lot of traveling Americans, so a lot of people touring in Australia, but then obviously a lot of people that I've met in Asia and Europe who originally called the US home. That can be quite a common story. You kind of have these people who I worked here, I went to university or college here, I was born here. But then when you actually come to the US, a lot of people are much more sedentary than I guess I thought they would be. A lot of people have sort of grown up and like, this is my town and I'll live and die in this town. But for someone who's called a lot of different places in the US home, like what's something about the experience of living in all these different states that's been really eye-opening for you?
I mean, okay, it's funny because this is not going to be a profound answer when people talk about, oh, people like the driving sucks here and here and here. And I haven't noticed that. Okay, that's something. This is a terrible answer, but people drive the same everywhere. Okay, people are assholes everywhere. And it's not something that's particular to like one city. People just are not going to be nice on the road basically anywhere. That's just one kind of funny observation that I feel like I can never relate when people say, "Oh, the driving here is the worst." It's like
I really like that, because as someone who has driven a Toyota Prius from Orange County to Chicago through the Midwest and back again and taken two different routes, you are 100% correct. People are awful on the roads no matter where you're from. So that's actually a good thing to destigmatize, because I've almost been run off the road by semi-trailers in Arizona. I've seen people refuse to merge in Milwaukee, and I dice with death every time I try and park my car in a car park in Orange County. So 100% agree.
Yeah. I could probably think of a bit like an eye-opening answer, but yeah, one is not coming to my head right now. I've really liked every place that I've lived, and I feel like I like learning about the history of each place. There's these beautiful like museums everywhere you go, like upstate New York. It's not obvious, but like that was a really important site for the like women's suffrage movement. So there's this really cool museum up in, I want to say, Skaneateles, which is like just a kind of random town in upstate New York, but I think it was the site of this like really important convention in the women's rights movement. So like everywhere you go in the US, there's these really cool like historical sites, and I love visiting those every chance that I would get.
I think you're a really excellent person to sort of start to distill some of what you're seeing and talk to what's actually happening in the US. You're someone who's Gen Z, so relatively young by comparison to the population, who's studied culture war for years, because I assume it's something that's deeply important and deeply interesting to you.
Yeah, it definitely is. I think there's kind of like a kernel of me search that drives the work that they do if they're like pursuing a PhD. And for me, it was growing up and not really seeing eye to eye with either one of my parents politically, because we would have these conversations about politics, which I quickly learned to just avoid because they got nowhere. But it would feel like we were on completely like different pages, where I had one set of like basic facts about reality that I was perceiving, and then my dad, when I would talk to him, he'd have this completely like mutually exclusive set of facts about reality, where I'm very pro LGBT, and I think that the Don't Say Gay bill in Florida is really terrible and damaging and will negatively impact every aspect of gay, trans youth lives. But my dad, if I'm talking to him, he'll be like, yeah, have you heard about what those drag queens are doing in schools, grooming the children? And I go like, whoa, we are on completely different pages here, and I'm not sure how we can find a middle ground. So it's those kinds of like conversations that have made me interested in like these disagreements. They're one of the biggest drivers of this kind of like red versus blue total hostility that we're seeing between people on different sides of the ideological divide right now. So that's kind of why I'm in the field that I'm in and why I'm so interested in it.
That's a really poignant point you've just made about the constructs of reality that people in the US are experiencing. Because, like you, I've heard people give me a series of quote unquote facts. You know, I've said it on another episode of this podcast, but I've been presented with a lot of facts about Australia since being here that I'm just like, no, that is wildly inaccurate. But what you're talking about is so much more intimate and it's something so many Americans I think are experiencing, which is my parents or my family, my uncle, my auntie, someone very close to me believes X and I believe Y, and now we don't talk or we don't have a relationship. And I'm not saying that's the point it's got to perhaps with your parents, but I certainly speak to a lot of people in the US who have lost a connection to family and friends through political ideology.
Yeah, it's tough to feel like, at least in my case, I still have a relationship with my dad, but I do definitely try to avoid any kind of political discussion with him, just because I know like it's basically like futile. Like I'm not going to convince him, and he's not going to convince me. So if we ever do start to have those kinds of discussions, it's either very long or it's very short, because I say, look, I'm not even sure how productive it would be for us to talk about this, because we're not going to convince each other. So yeah, it's a shame to feel like this is just kind of like a door that's closed to you, with a person that you care about.
If we can sort of go a little bit down this rabbit hole and start to think about what it is through your childhood or your upbringing that exposed you to a very different way of thinking than your parents.
Oh, that's interesting. Different way of thinking than my parents. I guess maybe would be relevant to say is, so my family is Jewish and Israeli. So I think one thing is that my parents both grew up in Israel and I didn't. So I think the beginning of my like split ideologically from my parents was after having moved to the US and being exposed to just a kind of more heterogeneous sort of information ecosystem about variety of issues, one of them being Israel, Palestine, but just any issue you can think of. I think that's one thing. And then going off to college, I think is very true what they say about people becoming more left-leaning when they go to college. That definitely happened to me. So yeah, I think it was just a combination of, associating with these kind of left-leaning peers growing up. Maybe a healthy dose of just wanting to rebel.
Yeah, there's truth there for sure.
That's probably universal. But I like to think that I also thought about these things for myself. I wasn't just trying to like look for conflict with my parents. I think it was kind of a mishmash of all those things.
I do think heterogeneous information ecosystem is the most academic thing that's been said on this podcast to date.
Yeah, leave it to me.
Nice. So it's interesting. I think, you talk about college being an experience that makes someone more left leaning, and it certainly can do that. I do think that exposure to people outside of your typical group of peers, family, friends that you've grown up with will expose you to different ways of thinking. And that can go either way, but it's often, to me, it's the big difference between growing up in a large city as opposed to growing up in a rural area. And I've lived in both areas, it sounds like you have as well, where people are more ready to embrace change or new ideas and new thinking if that's more part of their daily lives anyway. Whereas if you're living rurally, the concept of change can be very threatening.
Oh yeah. Yeah, I can only speak as somebody who has grown up in one of these like bigger areas. So I think it was already like quite diverse. So I think I had just grown up with that and being sort of more comfortable with change and new things. And but yeah, I can imagine how that would be tough for someone who had grown up all their life in a rural setting with a lot of people who look just like them.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, for me, this is an aside I won't go too deep into, but when I moved to a more rural area of Australia and 99% of the population were white, having some conversations with people and even professionally talking about some of the changes that corporate were going to be rolling out. I remember someone saying to me, a woman in her early 50s, saying like, no word scares me like the word change. And I was like, like change isn't scary, change is awesome. In this particular case, we were getting a new system built through our place of employment that was just going to speed things up a lot. And I was like, this is awesome. But she was like, nah, I don't like it. I don't like it because it's different. And I was like, interesting. What does that do to literally all of your social interactions and everything else? We're talking about like changing a computer system. To me, that's just one of the most natural things to just roll out and upgrade on. But yeah. And and later as I got to know her better, she was, didn't believe in climate change. And her husband was one of those people who thought that some human beings were reptiles. They were, it was kind of bizarre. But these beliefs were very deeply held and absolutely what they took to be truth.
Yeah, and I think they kind of clump together in a way. It's kind of like resistance to change and also this kind of like conspiratorial streak that seem to kind of naturally go together.
Conspiracy theories seem to be more prevalent in the US than any other country I've lived in. And I'm not sure if that's something you come across or experience in your study of culture wars in the US.
Yeah, they're definitely all over the place. I'm especially obsessed with this one called QAnon, and my favorite podcast after this one, of course.
Yeah. After the one you're actually on, let's not forget that.
Yeah, after that one, my favorite one is QAnon Anonymous, where they just kind of like report on the goings on around this huge umbrella sprawling conspiracy theory, which is basically about how the liberal elites in America are a cabal of child-eating pedophiles, Satanist pedophiles, essentially. And that entire worldview is so fascinating to me. And it's kind of wrapped up with like Trumpism and yeah, the way these things kind of cohere into a worldview is fascinating and terrifying at the same time. It also just feels like distinctly American, and I'm trying to put my finger on like why is the conspiracy theory such an American thing? And I feel like maybe part of it, like could be a small part of it, but part of it feels like this individualistic spirit that kind of underpins America might be part of what drives these beliefs where we need to believe that or we're trying to hold on to our individual rights so desperately that anything that feels like an infringement on those rights, like that has to be this goes all the way up to the top. Like they're trying to take our freedoms away. Anything that feels like an encroachment on like individual freedoms or property or anything, that just feels like such an American concern. And that also seems to be driving a lot of these conspiracist beliefs. It's concern over like they're trying to control us with the masks and the vaccines, and that all seems to be related in some way to me.
It's so interesting. I mean, so QAnon, and actually, to be fair, I'd never heard of QAnon before I came to the US, and I obviously need to do some more research on it because I did not know that like it's about liberal elites eating babies. That's what I haven't heard before, actually.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, okay. I will. I'll have to go and check out your favorite podcast. I'm not jealous, I promise. But I think what you're striking on about this concept of self and individuality in the US is really one of the biggest things I experienced as culture shock when I came here. This belief in the self being more important than the whole.
Yeah, I mean, just as like one example of this, I had to kind of do a little research for a manuscript that I'm helping to write up, and I had to look up what is the like legal definition of hate speech in the United States, and I found out that there is no legal definition of hate speech in the US. Like hate speech is not a legal term here, as opposed to basically every other Western country, like Canada has a legal definition. So many other Western countries who we like to compare ourselves to, they have some kind of legal definition of hate speech where if you're promoting hate against, somebody in a protected class, you can be fined or that's a crime of some sort. But in the United States, the Supreme Court has repeatedly upheld people's right to say hateful things that in other countries would be criminalized. So I've just found that to be really interesting and an example of this really unique emphasis on individual rights even at the expense of harm to other people.
Yes. I was just thinking, is it the Jim Crow laws? This is me trying to reach into going back to museums. I recently went to the Museum of African American History in Washington, D.C. And they have a wall there that has state by state legislation against minorities. Now I'm living in California, so that was the first place I gravitated to, and I was looking through like just the history of discriminatory laws. A lot of it's against people from China, a lot of it's obviously against black communities as well, but then every state had its own way of justifying racism or bigotry through law. And I was like, yeah, Australia's hands are not clean, but woof, a lot of this stuff, I was just like, this is deep justification for hatred and for retaining white power. And I know I'll get some flack for that from different groups for just saying it, but I'm also just like, go and read the Jim Crow laws if you want to before having a big old debate about this, because it's wild. So as you said, it's individualistic, but it's also state based as well. But as you said, there's no national stance on this. But I also think there's so many people in this country who hate the federal government.
Yeah, they absolutely do. And I think that's why you have such an emphasis on states' rights, just because that's like one step closer to having kind of like individual control. You don't have this big centralized body of just a few people telling the whole country what they can do. You have a little bit of more localized control where it might feel a little bit more personalized to the constituents in that region, or people maybe feel a little bit better represented on the state level.
Which I think works for some states, particularly the larger ones where you have tens of millions of people living in these states. But then how is that not just a slightly smaller version of a federal government? You mentioned Florida earlier. And what's happening there right now just feels like, let's create our own little fiefdom of our own little rules, our own way of writing history, our own way of treating certain groups, and you can't tell me not to. And I think it's incredibly dangerous when you have a country where states are starting to rewrite their own history. There's no national education curriculum. There's no national standard for these are the events as we understand them. Because 30 years down the track, you're going to have people who grew up in Florida versus people who grew up in California. I'm using these two as just extreme examples, who have completely different ideas and understandings of how America actually, like, what its history is. And that kind of blows my mind.
Yeah, I can't say I've thought like super thoroughly about this, but it has always struck me as a little strange that we basically just have like a confederation of a bunch of smaller countries, it feels like, who can all on some level make their own rules for themselves. And yeah, it strikes me as a little weird that from state to state you can get these different like curriculums and different rules about what can happen in schools and what can be taught and what can't be taught. And it is a little unsettling because it's like, what does it mean to be like a union of states if things can vary so much across states? I'm sure there's good reasons why, states should have control over certain things. Maybe that makes sense to decide on a state level. But things like abortion access, I don't understand why, if we're all American citizens, I feel like reproductive rights should apply evenly to all American citizens. So, yeah, you got me there. It's confusing.
Well, one of the first sort of, I guess, revelations for me was living in the United States is how ununited the states actually are.
Yeah.
And this is what you're studying. But advocates for states' rights and for going back to having more powerful states and a less regulated federal government, we start to see things like child labor laws being rolled back in certain states. We start to see things like the age of consent or the age of marriage being rolled back. What worries me is this very unregulated federal government still seems to cop all of the hatred. And this I believe is a both sides issue, where you have one side just hating on Trump and one side just hating on Biden. But also I'm like, well, what does the federal government actually do? If we're trying to depower it, destabilize it, and have these big state rights and everything else, to me, it's just like there's still this belief commonly held amongst American people that the president is this all powerful, controls the gas prices, controls how many immigrants are coming through borders, controls all of these things, but at the same time doesn't. I don't know. That's a strange little piece of Americana to me.
Yeah, it is interesting because in a lot of ways the president's hands, like, they're tied in a lot of ways. He can't, I mean, he has veto power over certain things. He has executive order power to do certain things, but he can't just do any given thing because a majority of people want him to do it. So it's got to be kind of an odd position to hold. But yeah, and honestly, like, this kind of fighting about vilifying Trump and vilifying Biden, that's also exactly what foreign powers who want to destroy America, that's also in their best interest to sow that kind of discord. So it's incredibly poisonous for that reason as well. And I think that's another reason to kind of be mindful about the really high level to which that's happening here.
I think you hit the nail on the head really well there. How many, we say, enemies or certainly rivals of the US are sitting back and smiling right now, watching this country tear itself apart. And this movement away from Americans to be able to see their fellow citizens as fellow citizens and not as the enemy. At no part in my life have I ever wished harm to an Australian from a different state, or believed that what is happening in one state is irredeemably evil or just something I could never identify with. But what is happening here is different. So I'm keen to sort of unlock a little bit about through your studies of looking at the rise of culture war. What gives you a glimmer of hope, or do you have any hope that one day we'll get to a more unified America?
Yeah, hope. As I talk, I'm sure I'll get to more of the hopeful things, so just bear with me. But what comes immediately to mind is not something hopeful. So maybe you can cut this out or whatever, but what I think immediately is just how extreme the younger generation, I guess my generation, is, and how like inflexible their ways of thinking can be, and just these like cancel mobs that you see online, and that's itself is very like disconcerting to me, this idea that like somebody needs to be completely deplatformed and I guess swept under the rug with no chance for them to grow, or even like their apology is like really scrutinized and picked to death. So that's something that is disturbing to me. But what's something that is feels hopeful for me, honestly, this is gonna sound terrible. I don't
No,
see a lot of hope. Um,
I don't
I'm
think you're alone in that, though. You know, I think a lot of people don't see hope.
I don't want to be negative. I mean, I think that there are reasonable people everywhere in this country across the ideological spectrum, and I think that if they could find a way to maybe talk to each other more, we need that. Right now, yeah, there's just this disturbing trend of like the most extremist person within like a political party is the one that's getting elected to Congress and things like that. Like Marjorie Taylor Greene. No idea how she got elected. I mean, she's got these crazy beliefs, in my opinion, about she was into QAnon. She is advocating for the nation to split apart, like literally divorce. That seems so against the spirit of how this country was founded. So these ideas that are kind of filtering their way into Congress makes me very concerned. But I know that there are a lot of organizations and think tanks that are dedicated to kind of undoing this trend. So like Data for Progress and More in Common, these are these kind of like think tanks who they just kind of like pull together data about just trying to show people that they have more in common with each other than they think. And one thing that is really relevant and can offer kind of a glimmer of hope is, so my lab, we study political polarization. And so recently we took part in this challenge kind of put out by this other really powerful like research lab group called the Strengthening Democracy Challenge. So this research group just got a bunch of money, I think from the National Science Foundation. I could be wrong, but they just got a bunch of money to solicit a number of research-based interventions that can reduce these things like partisan animosity and support for partisan violence and all of these really terrible outcomes that we're seeing as a result of this intense process of polarization that we're in. So that challenge is over now. They've got the results. They tested like 25 of these interventions that were submitted. And by intervention, I mean it's kind of analogous to like a clinical intervention. So if you've ever heard of like cognitive behavioral therapy, that is a clinical intervention that is aimed at changing how you think about the world in an effort to improve your mental health and reduce symptoms of depression. So these are like analogous things that are aimed at changing the way that people think about maybe ideological outgroups or people in the other political party in a way that will make them less hostile. So this was a really great research initiative because we came out of it with these kind of lessons about what sorts of interventions work to make people hate their ideological opponents less. And it was things like reducing misconceptions about what the other side thinks. So people tend to have these exaggerated misconceptions about like, what does the average Republican think about gun control? Or what does the average Democrat think about abortion? So things like that. So some of the most effective interventions to come out of this challenge were effective because they reduced these kind of like wildly exaggerated stereotypes that we have of our ideological opponents, closing some of these gaps of misunderstandings that we have about people who don't agree with us, and then just humanizing them, showing that they can be good people and they can do good things. That was, I think, also another effective strategy that came out of this challenge. So these initiatives like that, they give me hope because they are kind of putting scientific data behind these strategies to reduce polarization. So hopefully these are things that can be scaled up and actually used in the real world to reduce polarization. So it's, yeah, I feel like it's a very on-brand answer for me to give a science answer, but there you go.
Well, you're a scientist, and I'm talking to us. I mean, look, within the context of this show, we've had veterans, farmers, nurses. So your lens and your ability to speak to this is perfect, because you're going to approach a problem from a more analytical or data driven response, and that study sounds excellent.
One more thing I thought of. There's this research group at UNC who does great research on like political intolerance, and they put out this paper recently about how if you want to convince an ideological opponent to come a little closer to your position on a topic, then you really shouldn't try to use like facts and logic and reason. What would work better is if you share a personal experience or story related to that topic, especially one where you experienced harm, because that's going to be way more persuasive to them. So, for example, if I wanted to convince someone to come around to my position on gun ownership or gun restrictions, it would be more effective for me to share a personal story where maybe I was, or somebody I really cared about was harmed by free access to guns, versus me just spitting a bunch of statistics about school shootings at the person. So personal anecdotes really work a lot better to persuade other people than statistics and facts, which doesn't necessarily seem intuitive, but that's what they found.
So, welcome to Unpacking America, a podcast where we sit down and talk about people's experiences.
Yep.
How they're like, yeah, no, 100%. I mean, you're right. It isn't intuitive, but it's something I can fully appreciate.
Mm-hmm.
What I've come to learn about the US is it's deeply emotional. It's not surprising. I mean, the only time I ever watch news in the US is when I'm at the gym. And I'm on a treadmill or an elliptical, or I'm just forced to watch. There's like 8 television screens in front of me, all playing various news channels. And the things that are being discussed, and the vitriol, and the anger, and the hatred coming out of these talking heads is overwhelming. And if you're in an environment where these news channels are on 24/7, or you're inhaling and like you become this emotional outlet for all of these talking points. Many of them are teaching you or telling you to be fearful or hateful towards anything that they don't agree with that day. And that could be something as innocuous as the color of an M&M, which blows my mind that was a talking point on national news in this country. But here we are. This is the world that we're living in. But when you sit down with people and you actually ask them what they believe, and if they say something that you're like, do you really believe that? When people actually share with you what they actually believe, what's actually going on inside their heads, they know that a lot of what's being said on the media is bullshit. And when you actually can get them to talk openly about their own experiences, that's when I find there's an ability to connect and find some common ground.
Yeah, and that just goes to show like how unintuitive that is. I think people underestimate the power of these kind of like honest, sharing about what you believe and why and how you came to have those opinions. I think so much of our energy in America is directed at these kind of pissing competitions where we're trying to own the other side. And maybe that works best, in our little echo chambers by using these kind of hyperbolic arguments, but that's not really what changes hearts and minds,
Oh, I completely agree.
Right.
We held our politicians to higher standards. And now it just seems to be like, how can I make as many people angry as possible, no matter which side of the fence they're on? Because that's what drives clicks on Twitter. That's what drives news articles in the Washington Post. That's what drives people to discuss the ridiculous things I'm saying on CNN or Fox or whichever major news outlet's going to run that story.
Yeah, because eyes and attention and clicks translate to influence and power, and that's the only thing that matters now is one-upping your political opponents, which, yeah, the incentives are completely perverse, but that's where we are.
And those things are an excellent distraction for some of the more insidious things that politicians want to try and roll through. You know, we're all talking about Jewish space lasers for 2 weeks and we are asleep at the wheel when something else happens. That's my personal take on it. That's just how I see it.
No, totally.
There's a lot of sneaky little things, you know, like, and people that I speak to regularly are very up in arms about certain rights. And you said this earlier, like being taken away, you know, well, no one can tell me what to do. No one can tell me what kind of gun I can own or what I can and can't do on my property.
Mm-hmm.
But then other rights are slowly being eroded. And, you know, one of the things that's really good to get into with you as someone who's, you know, a Gen Z person, said that so awkwardly, someone who's of the Gen Z persuasion. But, you know, you have people like Vivek Ramaswamy, who is literally putting his hand up to be a presidential nominee on a platform of saying things like, oh, we should raise the voting age to 25. And where is the anger about those rights being taken away?
Yeah, I mean, I think you said it exactly. Like, it's all motivated, right? There's no principles underlying any of this. If they weren't concerned about raising the minimum voting age for 250 years or however long this country has existed. Oh, actually, that's not true. I think the voting age maybe it has changed, maybe around the Vietnam era. Yeah, in fact, it went down. But yeah, if there hasn't been like an uproar in recent years about the voting age, then that maybe should suggest something about their reasons for trying to do it now. And it's just like you were saying, like, yeah, they're struggling to engage the largely left-leaning younger block of voters. Pew did this analysis of like the United States like voting demographic. And for the first time, like in recent years, they're finding that there's like a lot of variation within the Democratic coalition, and they're identifying this small but I think growing block of progressive voters, and they're the youngest group. Interestingly, they're also the whitest group, but yeah, there's this like progressive block of voters that's like 12% of the body of voting people in the US. But they're very young, but they're also very left-leaning, and I think they scare the Republican Party a lot. And so yeah, I don't think that there's any actual like principles driving this initiative to raise the voting age. I think it's all just like a calculation about how can we get the most votes. And I think it's the same like quote unquote reasoning that underlies all of the attempts to suppress voting, or the attempts, I guess, to change laws around voting to require IDs and just things like that, which there's no language around racism in the laws themselves, but de facto they would have the effect of allowing fewer people of color to cast their votes. And so it's all just, I think, kind of a calculation about how can we use the law to exclude the people who we don't think will support us. So yeah, it's very disturbing to kind of see the laws sort of subverted for this purpose of just gaining power instead of doing what they're supposed to, which is to protect the rights and welfare of American citizens.
This country was founded on this principle of no taxation without representation, you know, and then you're saying, well, if you're 18 to 25, you don't get a seat at the table, but you'll be paying taxes, you'll be working probably for at least 7 years. Most people enter the workforce around the age of 18, possibly earlier, possibly later, sure. But let's say that's 7 years of you paying taxes in a country you have no voice in. That is bullshit. And I do think that anybody, no matter what side of the fence you're on, if you're left or right, Republican or Democrat, if you look at some of these statements that are coming out and you think about how this country was founded, I don't personally see how you can stand behind people who are saying these just ridiculous and outlandish things. It's the same as you mentioned national divorce earlier. People talk about it as if it's an inevitability.
That possibility is very scary because I have no idea what would happen if America as an entity just like ceased to exist. That would create such a huge vacuum of power on the world stage, and I just have who would fill in that vacuum. I think it would probably be one of these countries that we're already kind of nervous about, like China or Russia. these huge imperial genocidal powers. Not that America is not one of those,
Yeah.
but you know,
The best thing that could happen for America's enemies is a national divorce.
yeah, yes.
So any politician who is espousing that, any talking head who is espousing that, is giving America's global rivals exactly what they want.
Yeah, totally.
And that is, it's scary to me, right? And that I'm an Australian, we have a very strong military trade alliance with the US. And destabilization in the US affects my country. It affects a lot of other countries too. It affects NATO. It affects all of Europe. It's dangerous. And over what? I guess is my biggest thing.
Yeah,
Like
yeah.
what? Like because some people vote red and some people vote blue, and we've had enough. Like what is it? And maybe you can articulate this a little bit better than me because this is your field. Like what is this? What is at the center of this desire to split the country apart?
I think it's we just don't trust each other anymore. Everything is so deeply moralized that it's not just that, you and I might disagree on whether women should be able to terminate their pregnancies, is that I think, not me and you, but me and a hypothetical other person, I think that they are evil. Not even me personally, but two partisans, two deeply committed partisans in the United States. Their political disagreements are not just disagreements, they're mortal enemies at that point. It's like they can't both be good people in each other's eyes. And yeah, I think it's those kind of conditions that create the like, well, we just can't be neighbors anymore. We
It's
are
almost they can't both be American.
Yeah, that's a good way of putting it. And I honestly think that the marriage analogy is a really good one. It's just like irreconcilable differences is a reason that a lot of couples cite for getting divorced. Just like we will never see eye to eye on this. And it is such a disruption to our relationship. We can never have a normal, functional, healthy relationship with each other.
There's a sense of irony to me that some states are trying to roll back no fault divorce at the same time as some of their politicians are calling for a national divorce.
Yeah. That's very ironic. Only some kinds of divorce, they're okay.
Yeah.
Um
So I think a lot of what you're saying makes a lot of sense to me, and it's a problem, an endemic problem that I see with the US in its current position. There are ways out of it, but those ways out of it from what you've said about studies that are being done, they involve quite a deep and personal connection between partisan people and other ways of thinking. And that might be effective on a small scale, but I can't imagine that's a thing that's easy to roll out on a national level. When Biden came to power, he was all about trying to like bridge gaps and build together and all this sort of stuff. And I think I don't hear a lot of that rhetoric from him anymore. But I also don't think an 85-year-old white man sitting in a sitting in DC is the unifying voice this country actually needs right now. So I don't know where that call for harmony or reconciliation is going to come from or how it's going to manifest itself. But that's a very interesting thing to try and watch for, I think.
that's something that concerns me as well. But actually, one thing that's interesting that I should note from this Strengthening Democracy Challenge is maybe the most effective intervention was not actually something that anybody designed for the purposes of the challenge. It was an already existing Heineken commercial, so a beer commercial that had already existed for a few years that somebody just submitted to this thing, but it involved showing, I think, two kind of ideologically opposed people. Maybe one of them was, I think one was a white man, the other was a black woman, and it just showed them kind of like sitting at a table, I think maybe doing some kind of like puzzle together or some kind of like challenge, completing it together as a team. And then at the same time, I think they were kind of talking about politics. in a civil, polite way, and maybe having a Heineken at the same time, of course. But that was one of the most, if not the most effective tools at getting people to later say, you know what? No, I like, okay, I like, Republicans more now, or I support violence as a tool of my political agenda less now.
Hmm.
So yeah, it's interesting because this is like a messaging tool that could be actually scaled up in a really big way, to the extent that people are watching TV and view commercials and advertisements, that can be a tool that we use. So that gives me a little bit of hope. But yeah, it's
There's a
huh?
sense of irony for me that it's a German beer commercial that is helping to de-radicalize political opponents.
It's crazy, right? They weren't even trying.
Yeah.
Um, so it's funny because like what are social scientists even doing then? Like a
Mm.
team of marketing Don Draper types can create a better like anti-polarization intervention than hundreds of social scientists in the US. But
I feel like we could really spend all day talking about culture wars and unpacking things. I think within what you've said, there's some really good things for people to take away and think about. And one of them is really just almost turning that thing about the self that makes people so defiant or so angry or so scared in this country about like people taking rights away or what's mine and I need to hold on to it, I need to maintain that power. But the opposite of when you actually get that personal engagement from someone from the other side of the fence, that it's the personal that brings it back to being a place of understanding, which is a very poorly worded way of saying it's still the sense of self. It's just understanding other people's sense of self that seems to be the bridge between partisan ways of thinking.
yeah, it can't just be a focus on, strictly parochialism, like what's good for me and myself and people who are like me. There has to be some good faith effort to understand, why do other people disagree with me? Why do they have beliefs that I view as irredeemably evil? Like there has to be some kind of attempt to understand that, and maybe that obligation is more so on people who are in positions of privilege and power to try and understand those things. But I think that has to be done. Like we cannot just like stonewall people and say like, you are past the point of redemption for me. Like I'm just done with you. I don't think that's the way forward at all.
I think you said something really, really deep right at the start of this that I meant to leap on and failed to. When you talked about people of your generation being unable to bend or to accept an apology or to accept that people can change, it's a really big point. In fairness, I don't think it's a Gen Z exclusive point, but I do think this trial by media or this people are irredeemable concept is wrong and very damaging. And if you can't let people come outside of their way of thinking and try and change, and if they do try and change, you reject that change, you're just further pushing them into the only option that's left them, which is to go deeper down the echo chamber.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. And it doesn't help that like this might be bad to say, but like I think a lot of these people who participate in like the cancel campaigns online, they're pretty young, and they maybe like the feeling of participating in something, or feeling like their opinion matters, or they're on the right side of history or something. I have no data to back up this claim. I'm just this is just an observation that I have made. But I just think it's a lot of them are people who, if they were maybe older, might think twice about saying something like that on social media. But if you get like tens of thousands of these kinds of people saying the same thing all at once, then you've got this like snowball of a pylon onto somebody. And that's how these kind of cancel campaigns start. So I think that's also kind of like part of it. I don't really know what to do about that. But yeah, I just think it's like having this really powerful tool of social media and communication in the hands of young people with maybe brains that aren't fully developed is also dangerous.
Develop your brains more fully before engaging in social media cancel culture.
That's what I would say to the young
people. Well, behind you, the Gen Z, I believe the next generation coming up is Gen Alpha, and I can't wait to see what an entire generation who are referred to as the Alphas are gonna, evolve into. I think just even within this conversation today, there's a lot for people to take away, and I think you've come at it from a position of saying like, look, I lean further to the left, and I have these beliefs that are central to me, but not in a way that attacks the other side in any way, shape, or form. As someone who studies culture wars and identifies it as a problem, I think anybody in America right now would identify it as a problem, or should identify it as a problem. But your stance on it is really inclusive, and comes from a position of understanding. So I think even for listeners who are sort of sitting on the right side of the fence would hopefully hear what you're saying today and be like, yeah, you know what, I would sit down and have a beer with this woman. I would make a jigsaw puzzle with her, and I would talk politics with her. Maybe we'd both walk away with a little less hate in our souls.
Yeah, that is something that is a deeply held value of mine. And I think you approach it the same way, which is to just talk to people and see where they're coming from. And, I don't ever think like, oh, I'm open to being persuaded by them, or maybe I should be, but I don't ever close myself off to conversations with other people just because if I want to persuade them, let's say I'm only interested in persuading them, I have no interest in being persuaded by them, I still don't think it would be a good strategy for me to close myself off completely to a conversation with them, or to shun them or something like that.
Well, I think what you've just described is where America is going wrong right now.
Yeah.
It's that people are only coming at it from the position of, I'm here to persuade you and nothing else. You will not persuade me. And if you come into a conversation with that mindset, the other person is not going to, like, why would I invest time in being persuaded by someone who themselves has no interest in seeing my point of view?
Yeah.
And that right now is what, to me, the center of where the loggerheads are in the US.
Yeah. So you need to at least give people a chance and let them explain themselves in a way where in a sort of judgment-free zone. And even if you do have the goal of maybe changing their minds, it has to come from a place of compassion to the extent that you're able to do that. And in my position as, as a white straight person, I have a lot of that kind of, I guess, emotional capacity to do that, where I'm not drained super quickly. I just have fewer sort of identities for people to launch hate at me. So I feel a little bit, better positioned to absorb some of these really hateful things without them affecting me personally too much. So I kind of also see it as an obligation that I have to engage with those points of view, because I can, and they don't really harm me to the extent that they harm other people.
This morning when I was walking to get a coffee, my wife said that there is capacity for everyone to be both strong and compassionate. And that we have this belief some people hold this belief in the US that those two things are irreconcilable. To be strong is one thing, to be compassionate is another, and it's often viewed as a weakness. I look at I studied religion at university for a year as part of one of my courses. The center of a lot of religions is about compassion being a strength. And in a country that identifies so much more heavily than I ever realized it does with Christianity particularly, but with religion more broadly, I think it's about finding that sense of, or that harmony between being a strong person and a compassionate person. And honestly, just in having this conversation, I think you're one of these people that has that ability to be a very strong person and someone who can tackle these conversations head on, but also come at it from a position of understanding and a position of compassion. So I don't know. I think you're a good template for finding a solution to the problem that you're studying.
Well, thank you. I take that as a huge compliment and a sign that I'm living up to the values that I've, set for myself. So thank you.
Well, I feel we spoke a lot today about national divorce and how fragmented the country currently is, which is no accident because that's your field of expertise. But what I like to do with the podcast is try and find something at the end of every conversation about America that you think everybody should experience.
Yeah. Okay. So America has such a deep and complicated and morally gray history. And I think American history, that was always like one of my favorite subjects in school. And so I think I already touched a little bit on this with our discussion of museums just kind of scattered across the country. But I would say, like, go out and just experience all of the deep history that's all over the country. So like on the East Coast, you can learn so much about like American colonial history and all of the darkness that went into, and I say that because I think it's really important, and it can give people an appreciation for why things are the way that they are today. But I also, like, I think that there's also a lot of beauty in that history as well. Just in the culture that has come out of it. So thematically, one of the things that stands out most to me about America is just how enormously like terrible and dark it is, but how beautiful it can be at the same time. And maybe that like darkness also kind of enhances the beauty in a weird, like twisted way. So I would just say, like, if you want to go to the East Coast, there's so much like colonial history to learn about, the history of, musical genres like jazz. You can go to New Orleans and watch the Preservation Band Hall give this amazing performance of like, old school New Orleans jazz. Yeah, there's just these various places that kind of preserve different like cultural traditions that I just think are so cool and valuable. You go out west, you can learn about the 1800s, all the culture around cowboys and ranching and all the different kind of struggles that, our Native American populations experienced here. I just think that all of those things are super important to learn about if you are someone who's living in America. So it's kind of like a long-winded way of saying, go learn about American history.
Well, so my graduate degree, my thesis is in history, and it comes out on this podcast quite a lot. But I think what you've said is so deeply true. The darkest parts of your nation's history will help you celebrate the light. They'll help you celebrate now. Running away from history or rewriting history is cowardly. Have a difficult conversation with your kid. Have a hard be a teacher and teach your class the difficult and the ugly sides of things, because you need to embrace the darkest parts of your country's soul to understand why you're standing where you stand now.
100%.
Well, Shiri, thank you so much for taking the time to sit down and talk to me and help unpack a little bit more about America today. As a brief conversation about the current state of affairs and culture war and your personal thoughts on how to address it, I think it was excellent. So thank you very much.
Yeah, I'm so glad that I could share a little bit of what I do and what I think, and if it's helpful or interesting to people, great.
Something I really appreciate about how we came to the end of this episode was Shiri celebrating the unique cultural history of all these different aspects and parts of the United States. And that is something that if you listen to the last episode, where Stephen Presser was my guest, these are the things that he also cherishes and wants to preserve. And in terms of political beliefs, in terms of age and gender, you couldn't have two more different people on this show saying that they cherish similar things about the United States. And the shared values and the common beliefs, they don't stop there. They barely even start there. There's so much that people in this country have in common with each other. And that is something worthy of exploration and worthy of celebration. Because what unites you is stronger than what is dividing you. For the final interview episode of Unpacking America in Season 1, next week I am joined by Rio for a deeply personal story of what it is like to be Native American in modern day America. So join us for that conversation, please. We are also gathering all questions for our AMA, our Ask Me Anything episode that we will do at the end of Season 1. Myself and my co-producer will sit down and kind of break down the podcast, the themes that have been common, and we will be answering some of the questions that have come through over the course of the season from our listeners. So, guys, thank you very much for sticking out to the end. As always, I've been John David Easterling. This has been Unpacking America, and I very much hope to see you next week.